Soviet Union, advertising existed in a place where on paper it should not have mattered. In a planned economy, the state decided what factories would produce, how much they would ship, and where it would go. Prices were set administratively. Competition between brands was not supposed to be the engine of progress, because the official engine was the plan itself. And yet Soviet streets, newspapers, shop windows, exhibition halls, and later television screens carried a steady stream of ads. Not the kind meant to seduce you into buying what you do not need, but something stranger and more revealing. Advertising as a state instrument, advertising as instruction, advertising as ideology with a price tag attached. If you want to understand what was advertised in the USSR, you have to start by accepting the central contradiction. Soviet ads were real, widespread, and professionally produced, even as shortages of consumer goods were a chronic feature of daily life and product diversity was famously thin. That contradiction was not an accident. It was a symptom of how the Soviet system tried to manage modernity. Before 1917, advertising in the Russian Empire had already developed into a recognizable industry. Urban newspapers carried commercial notices, posters competed for attention, and merchants used modern visual language to sell everything from cigarettes to soap. The October Revolution of 1917 did not merely change who owned the means of production. It reset the logic of the public sphere. The new Bolshevik state moved quickly against private commerce and the institutions that supported it. Civil war, nationalization, and the collapse of the old market order were a shock not only to factories and farms, but to the entire ecosystem of commercial communication. The old advertising world built around private firms, brand rivalry, and consumer choice was effectively wiped out. In its place, a new state had to decide what public persuasion would look like in a society that claimed to be abolishing the very conditions that made advertising necessary. The early 1920s were the first moment when the Soviet government openly allowed advertising to reappear, and the timing matters. By 1921, the Bolsheviks were facing economic ruin and political danger. War communism had pushed requisitions and centralized control to the extreme, and the result was catastrophe, collapsing production, famine, and uprisings. The leadership responded with the new economic policy, announced in 1921, which reintroduced limited market mechanisms, legalized certain forms of private trade, and allowed cooperatives and state enterprises to operate with more commercial flexibility. In that context, printed advertising was legalized in 1921 for state organizations, cooperatives, and individuals. This was not a return to the pre-revolutionary marketplace. It was a controlled concession, a tool to make a partially revived consumer sphere function without surrendering political control. Soon after legalization, the first advertising agency run by a Soviet newspaper began publicly offering services that sound, at first glance, like any modern media business. It placed ads in periodicals, distributed posters across the country, circulated price lists and brochures, published directories and catalogs, and promoted products at exhibitions and fairs. This is one of the most important clues about Soviet advertising. It was institutionalized early, and it was tied to state media infrastructure. The press was not a neutral platform selling space to whoever paid the most. It was a political instrument. When it offered advertising services, it did so inside a system where information, persuasion, and state priorities were already tightly interwoven. But what were these ads actually for? In capitalist economies, advertising is designed to create demand, to differentiate brands, and to push consumers toward a purchase. In the Soviet case, the goal was different. Soviet advertising, in its own logic, was not supposed to convince a buyer to purchase a product regardless of its quality. It was supposed to inform the consumer that a new product existed and was available. That distinction seems minor until you place it inside a planned economy. If the state decides what appears in stores, and if stores frequently have empty shelves, then the most valuable information is not "this is better than that," but "this exists at all," and even more crucially, "this exists here now." Soviet advertising became a kind of public notice system for consumption, a way to direct citizens through the bottlenecks of distribution. That informational function also reveals a deeper political purpose. The Soviet state needed to demonstrate that socialism could deliver a modern standard of living. Consumer goods were not merely comforts, they were proof. Every new refrigerator, every improved fabric, every packaged food item, every tube of toothpaste could be framed as evidence that the planned economy was advancing, that the system was overcoming scarcity, that the future was arriving on schedule. Advertising, in this sense, became a stage-managed display of progress. It did not have to reflect the full reality of availability, it had to reflect the narrative of development. In the late 1920s and into the mid-1930s, Soviet advertising acquired a stylistic unity that mirrored broader shifts in Soviet culture. This was the era of rapid industrialization and forced collectivization, the years of the first five-year plan beginning in 1928, and the transformation of society under Joseph Stalin. Visual culture in these years often leaned on the language of constructivism, sharp geometry, bold typography, photomontage, dynamic diagonals designed to look modern, urgent, and functional. In advertising, those elements became hallmarks, applications and photographs, text arranged with strong composition, enlarged typefaces for emphasis, exclamation marks, and color highlighting. The result was a kind of documentary expressiveness. The ad did not whisper, it declared. It looked like a command, or a bulletin, or a poster for a political campaign, because it shared the same visual DNA. That is not accidental. Advertising in the USSR became ideologized, one tool among many for political influence, shaping attitudes and values useful to the government. This was not hidden. Soviet public communication was built on the assumption that the state had the right to educate, mobilize, and direct the population. Capitalist advertising was often criticized by Soviet ideologues as manipulative and profit-driven. Soviet advertising defended itself as rational and socially purposeful. It would not inflame artificial desires. It would guide citizens toward modern, hygienic, efficient consumption. It would teach people how to live in a socialist city, how to eat, how to dress, how to furnish an apartment, how to use new technologies. The product was real, but the message was always bigger than the product. Buy this and you are participating in progress. Use this and you are living correctly. To see how this worked, picture the Soviet urban landscape as it changed across the mid-20th century. The state built new industrial cities, expanded old ones, and pushed millions into urban apartments. Mass literacy campaigns and expanded education created a population increasingly capable of reading and interpreting printed media. Newspapers and magazines were everywhere, not simply as entertainment, but as civic space. An advertisement in such a society did not float in a sea of competing private messages. It appeared beside political editorials, production targets, and foreign policy narratives. The consumer was also a citizen in a permanent mobilization campaign. Even when the ad was about something as mundane as soap or canned food, it existed inside a moral universe where cleanliness, nutrition, and efficiency were political virtues. And then there is the issue that makes Soviet advertising feel almost surreal to modern viewers: deficit. Shortages were not a side effect, they were structural. A planned economy can allocate resources on a massive scale, but it struggles with fine-grained responsiveness to consumer preferences, local demand, and changing tastes. Throughout Soviet history, especially in the post-war decades, many consumer goods were difficult to obtain consistently. People queued. They relied on personal networks. They traveled across cities to find items that appeared unpredictably. In that environment, advertising could look like mockery, glossy images of products that citizens could not easily buy. The Soviet system tried to solve this contradiction not by abandoning advertising, but by redefining its meaning. The ad was not a promise that you could buy it anytime. It was a signal that the state was producing it, that it existed somewhere in the supply chain, that the system was capable of making it. Public reaction to this was complex. Soviet people were not passive receivers of official messages. Over time, especially as cultural and educational levels rose from the 1950s through the 1980s, audiences developed a more layered relationship to official persuasion. Advertising was often perceived similarly to propaganda, sometimes accepted, sometimes ignored, sometimes treated with irony or skepticism. That irony mattered. It signaled a gap between the state's image of abundance and the citizens' lived experience of scarcity. Every time an ad showed a neatly stocked counter, it risked reminding viewers of the empty shelf. Every time it announced a new product, it risked highlighting how few alternatives existed. The post-war period intensified these dynamics. The Soviet Union emerged from World War II, known domestically as the Great Patriotic War, with enormous human and material losses. Entire regions were devastated. Rebuilding heavy industry and military capacity took priority, and consumer comfort was often postponed. Yet the Cold War turned consumption into a battlefield of legitimacy. In the United States and Western Europe, rising consumer abundance became part of the political story. Capitalism delivers. The Soviet leadership could not ignore that comparison. Even when resources were constrained, the state had to show that socialism could provide modern life. Advertising, exhibitions, and new goods showcases became part of that competition, even if the underlying production system could not always match the image. By the second half of the 1950s, another twist appeared. Foreign companies began to place advertisements inside the USSR. This is one of the most striking facts about Soviet advertising because it reveals cracks in the ideological wall. The Soviet Union was not sealed off from global commerce. It traded, it imported, it negotiated technology transfers, and it used international exhibitions to project power. Allowing some foreign advertising did not mean embracing Western consumer culture. It meant managing contact with it. The state could control where, how, and why foreign messages appeared, and it could monetize access to Soviet media. There was even a published price structure for foreign organizations seeking ad placement. A full page in Nedelia, the Sunday supplement to Izvestia, cost 2,856 rubles. The third or fourth cover position in a magazine called New Goods was priced at 225 rubles. A minute of television time was 400 rubles. These numbers matter not only as trivia, but as evidence of bureaucratic normalization. Foreign advertising was not an underground phenomenon. It was administratively priced, regulated, and folded into Soviet media economics. The Soviet state, which publicly condemned capitalist advertising as a tool of exploitation, still recognized that media space had value and could be sold under controlled conditions. This controlled openness also highlights another feature of Soviet advertising. When it promoted Soviet products abroad, it often aimed for an objective tone, presenting the product without overtly urging the buyer to desire it. That approach aligned with Soviet self-image. It also functioned diplomatically. Soviet exports machinery, watches, cameras, textiles, even cultural products were part of foreign trade strategy, and the USSR wanted to appear serious, modern, and reliable rather than flashy. The goal was credibility. In the Cold War, credibility was currency. The most revealing moment in the late Soviet advertising story arrives in the second half of the 1960s under Leonid Brezhnev. By then, the USSR had stabilized after the upheavals of Stalin's death in 1953 and Nikita Khrushchev's removal in 1964. The Brezhnev era is often associated with stagnation, but it was also a period of bureaucratic consolidation, expanding social guarantees, and an attempt to normalize Soviet life. Consumer expectations were rising. Urban citizens wanted better clothing, better household goods, better food quality, and more variety. The system responded with a mix of reforms and half-measures, including a surprising intervention. Brezhnev demanded that manufacturers across the country spend money on advertising. From that point, every enterprise, large or small, was expected to allocate 1% of its revenue to advertising. In a market economy, firms advertise because they fear losing customers to rivals. In the USSR, enterprises often had guaranteed demand, limited competition, and production targets that mattered more than consumer satisfaction. So why force them to advertise? Because the state was trying to solve several problems at once. First, it wanted to modernize the appearance of Soviet consumption to make the system look dynamic and responsive. Second, it wanted to discipline producers into thinking about presentation, packaging, and public perception, areas where Soviet goods were often criticized, including by Soviet citizens. Third, it wanted to create informational channels so that new products, when they did appear, could be recognized and distributed more effectively. Advertising was a management tool, a way to push enterprises into a more consumer-facing posture without surrendering the plan. But the 1% rule also produced absurd incentives. When you force every enterprise to spend on advertising regardless of whether advertising makes sense, you generate campaigns that feel detached from reality. One documented example involves Desinter's, a perfume manufacturer. Perfume is a product category where branding and differentiation matter intensely in capitalist markets. In the Soviet context, Desinter's produced items that often differed only slightly from one another, yet the enterprise still advertised them broadly. The logic was not purely commercial, it was bureaucratic. Money had to be spent, plans had to be fulfilled. Advertising became another quota-like activity, a box to check, even when product variety was limited and the consumer could not always choose freely. This is where Soviet advertising becomes a window into the mechanics of the system. The USSR could produce sophisticated visuals, memorable slogans, and coherent campaigns. It could mobilize artists, photographers, printers, and later television studios. It could standardize style across an enormous territory. But it could not easily align message with material reality because information moved differently than goods. An ad could be printed overnight. A shipment of consumer products could be delayed for weeks. A poster could declare availability. The store could be empty. In capitalist systems, misleading advertising can be punished by competition, consumer backlash, or regulation. In the Soviet system, the feedback loop was weaker. The state controlled both the message and much of the distribution, so the contradiction could persist without immediate correction. The cost was public cynicism. It would be a mistake to treat Soviet advertising as merely farce. It was also an archive of genuine aspirations. When you look at Soviet ads across decades, you see what the state wanted people to value: hygiene, rational consumption, modern appliances, standardized quality, scientific progress, healthy children, productive leisure. You see the push toward urban domesticity: refrigerators, washing machines, radios, televisions, furniture suited to apartments rather than village houses. You see the attempt to shape taste itself, to teach citizens what modern life should look like. In that sense, advertising was part of social engineering. It was not just telling you that a product existed, it was telling you what kind of person you should be when you used it. Stylistic unity of Soviet advertising reinforced that mission. Constructivist elements in earlier decades gave way to later Soviet visual norms, but the underlying tone remained: authoritative, instructional, confident. Even when an ad was cheerful, it carried the weight of the state's voice. The consumer was not flattered as a sovereign chooser. The consumer was addressed as a participant in a collective project. This difference shaped everything. In Western advertising, desire is often individualized. In Soviet advertising, desire was supposed to be socially aligned. The good consumer was the one whose needs matched the plan's offerings and whose preferences could be standardized. And standardization was not only ideological, it was practical. A planned economy functions more smoothly when it can reduce complexity. Fewer models, fewer variations, fewer packaging types, fewer supply chain branches. But people are not standardized. As education expanded and as Soviet citizens became more exposed to global culture through films, radio, international events, and limited travel, the mismatch between standardized offerings and diverse desires widened. Advertising tried to bridge that gap by making standardized goods feel exciting. If the product could not be radically different, the presentation could be. If the choice was limited, the image could be expansive. This is why Soviet advertising often feels like it is selling a future that is always arriving but never fully here. It announces new goods, emphasizes novelty, highlights modern design, and frames consumption as progress. But the system's chronic inability to provide consistent abundance meant the future remained unevenly distributed. Some cities and regions enjoyed better supply than others. Some social groups had better access through workplace distribution, special stores, or connections. The official message of equality collided with the unofficial reality of privilege. Advertising, by broadcasting images of goods, sometimes unintentionally exposed those inequalities. If you cannot buy what you see, you start asking who can. Foreign advertising inside the USSR sharpened that effect. Even limited exposure to Western brands could function as a comparative mirror. The Soviet state tried to control the narrative, But comparison is a powerful force. The Cold War was not only about missiles and alliances, it was about everyday life as evidence of system performance. When Soviet citizens saw foreign products advertised, however carefully framed, they were reminded that another world of consumption existed, one where advertising matched shelves more often than not. The Soviet leadership understood this danger, which is why foreign advertising remained controlled and relatively limited. But even controlled contact could alter expectations. By the 1970s and 1980s, the gap between image and availability became harder to manage. The Soviet economy faced mounting inefficiencies, technological lag in certain sectors, and growing burdens from military spending and commitments across the Eastern Bloc and beyond. Advertising could not solve production problems. It could only repackage them. As skepticism grew, the persuasive power of official messaging weakened. People learned to read between the lines, to treat announcements of available now as signals to hurry, to queue, to call friends, to leverage networks. Advertising became part of the scavenger hunt of Soviet consumption. It did not create leisurely choice. It triggered urgent pursuit. And still the body of work remained. Posters, magazine spreads, television spots, exhibition materials, these artifacts survived the state that produced them. They are now evidence, not of a consumer paradise, but of a system trying to narrate itself. They show what the USSR wanted to be seen as: modern, rational, caring for the citizens' welfare, capable of producing comfort alongside steel and rockets. They also show the limits of that narrative, because the very need to insist on abundance is often a sign that abundance is insecure. What was advertised in the USSR is, in the end, the wrong question unless you ask the second one: why was it advertised at all? The answer leads straight into the machinery of the Soviet state. Advertising was legalized in 1921 as part of a controlled economic retreat and recalibration. It developed a unified style in the late 1920s and mid-1930s that matched the era's political urgency and visual modernism. It became ideologized, designed to shape values and attitudes, not merely shopping habits. It persisted through decades of shortage because it served as information management and legitimacy management. It was even mandated more aggressively in the late 1960s under Brezhnev through a 1% spending requirement, producing campaigns that could be bizarrely disconnected from actual consumer choice, as in the case of Dezinter's promoting near-identical perfumes. It allowed foreign companies to buy space in Soviet media from the second half of the 1950s, with published rates 2856 rubles for a page in Nedelia, 225 rubles for coveted magazine cover positions in New Goods, 400 rubles for a minute of television, because the Soviet system could condemn capitalist persuasion while still monetizing controlled access to its audience. The modern consequence of this history is not nostalgia or mockery. It is a warning about how communication systems behave when they are severed from consumer sovereignty and competitive correction. Soviet advertising shows what happens when the message is designed to confirm a political narrative rather than respond to a buyer's power. It also shows how citizens adapt, developing irony, skepticism, and informal networks to compensate for the gap between image and reality. In the 21st century, the technologies have changed, but the underlying question remains familiar. When institutions broadcast confident images of progress, how do we measure the distance between what is shown and what is lived? The Soviet Union's advertisements, preserved like fossils of a vanished state, remind us that the most revealing propaganda is often not what it hides, but what it unintentionally admits: its needs, its anxieties, and the reality it is trying, relentlessly, to outrun.